home to officially open what is for us a special occasion as well, because this is the first of the beginning of a year-long anniversary celebration and looking to the future for Urban's Housing Finance Policy Center. But before I jump into my remarks, I need to do the usual housekeeping. We are broadcasting and we are recording this event. The recording, the slides, and additional content that may be shared by presenters will be shared after the event online. If you are online today, we have enabled live captions, and you can turn them on or turn them off by clicking on the CC button on the bottom right corner of your media player. We love to engage people in the conversation, both online and in person. If you're in the virtual audience, to ask questions, put your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll collect them for the panelists. And for those of you who are attending in person, you can access the event dashboard using the QR codes, right, aren't we fancy, on your tables. You can also access the speaker bios. We're going to save everybody time from reciting how wonderful we all are by looking at their bios on the event dashboard, again, using the QR code. And if you want to join the conversation on the platform that is formerly known as Twitter or on any other platform, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So with the logistics behind me, let me start by again thanking Joe Scantlebury, Lakeisha Fox, and the entire Living Cities team for partnering us to bring together not only this event, but to make possible the research that we're sharing today. More profoundly, I want to thank Living Cities for bringing our organizations together on a journey to address the challenge of wealth inequality. To my mind, the racial wealth gap is the single most important way that inequality is transmitted from generation to generation, and the system and structures that perpetuate wealth inequality are a key part of the scaffolding of structural racism. So I appreciate that Living Cities has put homeownership at the center of your work. We're eager to find ways together with you to accelerate solutions by contributing what we can at Urban, from analysis and evidence to your work to advance strategies to break down the barriers to homeownership and to reverse decades of suppression of wealth building for Black people and all communities of color. Whoops. My notes got out of order. I apologize. I was supposed to say something really important at the beginning, and I didn't, so let me say it now. You may have seen that FEMA and FCC are doing a nationwide test of the emergency alert system in about 10 minutes at 2:20 p.m. The alert is going to be sent to all of our cell phones, and it will probably even maybe break past your turn alerts off notifications. And it will take place in the middle of Deputy Secretary Todeman's address. So we're going to ask you all to go ahead right now and make sure your phones are silent and perhaps even off until 2:20. And then afterwards you can turn them back on and join the conversation live at Urban. If we can, when it comes, if it's disruptive for a sec, let's all have a sense of humor, but let's try to get back to work as soon as we can. So for 10 years, I've been at Urban for 12, and about 10 years ago, we launched the Urban's Housing Finance Policy Center. And it is focused on bringing data and evidence to the conversation to draw attention to and inform ways of closing the homeownership gap. I don't need to tell the people who came here today that homeownership is usually a family's or individual's largest asset, and it is by far the superior vehicle for creating wealth and economic stability for households in America. Should it be the only way that we have to build wealth? Of course not, and there are many other conversations to be had. But over American history, there is no other mechanism that has meant as much, I could say, for my family, for my parents' first home, and what it meant for my opportunities for school, and I'm sure for so many others. But for so many others, it's not that opportunity, and we need to ensure that it is. So many laws, norms, and practices still limit the ability of households to achieve homeownership. So today, our Housing Finance Policy Center, in collaboration with Living Cities, has released a new report called A Landscape Scan of Homeownership for Households of Color. Among other things, research from the report demonstrates that closing the racial homeownership gap will not necessarily close corresponding housing wealth gaps. In other words, we need to be intentional not just to close how many people own a home, but how many people can benefit from owning a home. Today's event is going to discuss policy solutions and ways to ensure that homeownership outcomes more broadly are optimized for households of color. I also want to highlight that today's event marks the first in this year-long series for the Housing Finance Policy Center's 10th anniversary, which we're calling Next 10, The Future of Home. Over the next year, under the leadership of Yannicka Ratcliffe, the center's director, and its fabulous team of researchers, many of whom are here today, this series will bring together leaders and collaborators from a wide array of sectors to explore promising ideas and bold solutions to the U.S. housing finance system, to build important and lasting partnerships with many allies, and to inspire transformative action over the next decade and beyond. We're going to be hosting events like today's and many other collaborative partnerships that will help us inform the framework for the Housing Finance Center's next 10 years of work. So now I want to introduce our featured speaker and a great friend of these issues and of all of us, Adrienne Toedtman, who is the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, a whole 18 inches to the south of us here at Urban. Deputy Secretary Toedtman has dedicated her career to improving people's lives and strengthening neighborhoods through housing and strong community development. Most recently, she served as the CEO of NARO from 2017 to 2021, and during her tenure, she improved the association's financial standing, business operations. She created a member-centric culture and advocated for funding and policies to preserve and develop affordable housing to help communities thrive. As Deputy Secretary today, she works alongside the Secretary, Marcia Fudge, to ensure that HUD has the staff and tools it needs to administer and provide oversight over programs critical to supporting people and communities across the country. We were just talking in the back about the hardships that are ongoing in Hawaii after those terrible fires, and it's clearly core and passion for her, as it is for so many. She's an inspiring leader and a great friend, a graduate of Smith College and a DC resident. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Secretary Toedtman.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to be here at Urban Institute. I came miles and miles and miles just to be here, Sarah, to join you, and I want to congratulate both you and Living Cities for this phenomenal gathering of wonderful people to talk about a really critical issue, and greetings from Secretary Fudge as well. I think Sarah has already made the case for why we need to be amongst each other today and having this conversation. So I don't need to spend too much time to make that case, but it is important to continue to say these numbers out loud. The fact that we have Black and Hispanic Americans who are at 45.9% and 48.6% respectively as their homeownership rates, compared to white Americans who are at 74.4%. We need to repeat those numbers so they can sink in, because those are the facts and why we do this work. You know, as we debate the future of this country and decide which priorities are most important for HUD, the Secretary Fudge made it clear that closing the racial homeownership gap is one of the most pressing matters we can attend to. And HUD is thankfully filled with brilliant people. I see one of my colleagues here, Demetria McCain, you'll hear from later today, filled with brilliant people who are looking at this every single day. And over the course of the past just over 2 years of our time at HUD, I think we have really done some really thoughtful things and put in action sort of the spirit of things that we want to have done to reduce the homeownership gap that we have. I'll share some of that work. One of the things that we are looking at is clearly supply. When I speak to people across the country, it is one thing to provide access to credit, one thing to improve financing, but people then still actually have to go and find a home to purchase. So Many of you may be aware, maybe you're not aware, that the White House and the entire federal family put together a housing supply action plan last year, and we updated it this year. And it's focused not just on ways we can improve the condition of housing in terms of creation and preservation for rental, it is also focused on homeownership as well. And we want to make sure that as we are increasing the housing supply so everybody has access to safe and affordable housing, that we're reducing barriers to build housing and expanding financing for affordable and energy-efficient housing across the country. I also had an opportunity to sit with local leaders, local housing leaders, sort of practitioners, about ways in which they're doing their work day to day, and quite frankly, things that we can do at HUD to improve access to our programs and how they're working on the ground. One thing we're very proud of that we announced this past several weeks ago was our Pathways to Removing Obstacles to Housing, or our Pro Housing. Has anybody heard of our Pro Housing program? A couple folks, which is a brand new $85 million opportunity. It's a program that provides communities with funding to identify and remove barriers to affordable housing production and preservation. This is our response to making sure that zoning rules and the local processes are not impeding our process in terms of building more rental and homeownership units. We know that single-family starts rose this summer. We know that sales of new homes rose as well, even as existing home sales slightly fell. So there is certainly work to do, but there's certainly progress. And we want to make sure that as those new homes are coming online, that they're being provided to individuals who need home ownership the most in terms of making sure generational wealth is accumulated across this country. That leads me to financing. This is HUD's superpower. All of you are aware of FHA. I don't need to give you the spiel about it being part of HUD, not with this crowd. And you also know that it is one of the key places that particularly first-time homeowners go to, that Black Americans go to, that Hispanic Americans go to try to purchase their first home. And our job is try to make homeownership less costly for millions of Americans. One of the things that we did earlier this year, which was historic, and I continue to say that, it seems like the press announcement felt like it was a fait accompli, but it took a lot of effort for us to finally reduce the MIP fee. Folks were aware of that, I'm sure, that reduction occurred. There you go. No, that's a big deal. Thank you. And let me just say, there's one day when I write the book, this will be one of the stories that's told about what we had to do to get to this point. But it's something, no laughing, Demetria, but it was something very important to the Secretary, and it happened. And I think we're very proud of that. And I think we've hopefully set a path for what that looks like in years to come. But what we are grateful for, most importantly, is that we believe that that one action over the course of 1 year will save Americans $600 million and billions over the next decade. That is improving housing affordability across the country. And then late last year, we know that many first-time buyers have debt, have student debt. And we know that we could improve the way that we calculate debt into creditworthiness. And so we took a hard look at that and improved it as well. We didn't stop there. We also implemented changes to our underwriting policies to permit lenders to use positive rental history as a factor in evaluating an applicant's creditworthiness as well. These seem like small things, but we know that for folks, the targeted folks we're talking about, these are big issues. Ways that we calculate student debt, looking at positive rental income. These are really critical, common sense things that HUD did, and there's more to come. Not just supply, not just credit. We need to make sure people actually are aware that they have access to our programs. And this is something that is near and dear to the Secretary, who, as a former mayor, was amazed at all the wonderful work that HUD does when she became our very august secretary. And she made it a point to make sure that we were teaching folks, mayors, governors, nonprofits, of all the things, all the power that HUD can bring to bear locally through our programs, through our policies. And we are doing just that. One of the ways that we're doing that is making sure that I call them our army of housing counselors. We have 4,000 housing counselors across the country who are really in many ways the front line to the work that we're doing to improve access to all the things that I just mentioned. In fact, we have 3,000 consumers who call us every single day, 3,000 who call us every single day to obtain more information about HUD's programs and just the homeownership path in general. One of the things that the Secretary also did is to create a great concept of a house party, right? Who's not been to a house party? You look like you've been to a house party or two. Who's not been? Right, the house party is a great concept. And what we did was we made sure that we created a space where particularly some of the younger folks had an introduction to something as complicated as homeownership in a setting that was relaxed and that was perhaps entertaining. And so we had our first house party, but last fall, it was virtual, had about 4,000 individuals who showed up virtually. But then we had another house party in person on the mall this past summer. It was aligned with our innovative housing showcase. And there was a great success, so much so that our secretaries, and it's right, Demetria turned to the regional offices and said, everybody is going to do a house party across the country. And we've been doing that, again, as a way to create that first touch, that first moment of, I want to buy a home, but how? An opportunity for folks to come into a threat-free environment and learn more about access to homeownership. And there we go. Go FEMA! That's right. That's right, FEMA and FCC, interagency success. We want to make sure that we can all be aware of not just homeownership, but disasters as well. There we go. Let's hear it for our federal family. So we've had house parties throughout the country, not all of them with a siren attached, but we've had house parties across the country just to make sure that people had access to information, particularly our first-time and first-gen homeowners. And then that leads us to, and there we go. That's okay. This is keeping the country safe. That's right. It's working, right? Everybody's phone went off? Okay, call your carrier if it did not. Don't call the federal government. Don't call us. Okay, so one of the things that we're doing and why I'm so excited that Demetria is here is the other piece to the work that we do. We talked about supply, we talk about financing, we talk about access to information. But then what do we do when people aren't doing the right thing? What do we do when institutions, organizations, and people are creating unfair barriers and discriminating against people on their path to homeownership and worse, delaying generational wealth accumulation? It's one of the reasons why earlier this year we released our Agenda for Economic Justice, which is our plan to ensure low-income Americans can save money, improve their credit, and also build assets. We're working with our 1,300 family self-sufficiency coordinators across the country and a medley of other nonprofit leaders and groups to make sure that we are not just helping moderate income families have access to homeownership, but teaching and helping low-income Americans understand what that path also looks like. An important element of this work is our effort to root out racial discrimination from home appraisals, an issue that protracts the racial wealth gap for too many families of color. Making appraisal data available to the public all the way to establishing quality control standards to fairly assess home values is among the many critical actions that we are taking, and not just HUD. It's very rare, well, it's normal for the domestic agencies to come together, HUD, education, labor, HHS, and others, and talk about issues of the day. Not as usual is having HUD and Treasury and all of the financial regulators come together and talk from one song sheet about how can we move the needle on everything, on anything. But this topic brought the administration together, didn't it, Demetria? This topic really galvanized an action, which is let's make sure that once someone owns a home, that there's absolutely no one who is standing in the path to generational wealth, no one that's discriminating and really reducing appraisal bias across this country. There's a number, too long for me to get into, a number of different actions that we are undertaking across the federal family that I'm so very proud of, and I'm sure that my colleague Demetria will go into more detail during her time on her panel. But know that this is something that was a White House priority. It was led by the Secretary and Susan Rice, who you recall was our DPC chair, and our Nera Tandon. But it's something that is an active body, even though you might not be seeing it, continues to be an active body of work that we know will make a change in thousands of people's lives forever. A very tangible, common sense thing that we know will make a difference. Look, every single family deserves the chance to build wealth by purchasing a home, if that is their choice. Race should not in any way be a factor. Barriers to pursuing homeownership doesn't only harm African Americans and Hispanic Americans, it really harms all of us. It harms our economy. By putting homeownership further out of reach, we are preventing our communities from being further developed and preventing an entire generation of families from purchasing power that benefits businesses, schools, neighborhoods. I know that with you all, we are building a future in which no family needs to hide a family photo to receive a fair home appraisal. A future where young people, no matter their race, their family, or socioeconomic background, can realistically save for and purchase a home if that is what they choose to do. A future where wealth earned via homeownership can be passed down generation to generation. You know, every parent wants something better for their kids, every single one. I know my grandmother wanted that for my mother. My mother wanted that for me. And I certainly want it for my wonderfully talented and gorgeous 27-year-old daughter. That is what we want. That is how this country has grown better and stronger. But we've fallen back. And I think it's rooms like this and rooms across the country where we can lean in and go back to making sure that we are achieving the American promise for everybody in this country. I want to thank you all for your brilliance throughout the afternoon, and thank you again to Urban Institute and Living Cities for bringing us together. Stay well.
Wow. I'm filled right now. I'm filled because to hear a public leader, a federal leader, be so clear, be so personal, and frankly, to recognize the brilliance in this room, I'm honored to be here, but more importantly, I'm excited for the conversation we're about to have. Sarah, where are you? She stepped out? I want to thank Sarah and the Urban Institute Housing Finance Policy team for giving us a reason to come together. First of all, celebrating your 10th anniversary and where we go from here. I want to thank my colleague Lakeisha Fox for persevering in pulling this together because it ain't easy, right? It ain't easy, we know this. But let me share a couple of things. First of all, Deputy Secretary Todman, thank you for your remarks. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for making it so personal, so real, and for giving some of us who don't know a whole lot about all the things that the agencies do a reason for hope. Thank you. I'm Joe Scantlebury, the President and CEO of Living Cities, and I'm honored to welcome you to learn more about the work of Living Cities and the work that we've been doing across the country for some years. We were founded in 1991, as a collaborative of leading and prominent financial institutions and foundations. And those institutions and foundations resolved some years ago to lean into racial equity. They didn't necessarily have a big march about it. They didn't have a big banner or poster. They simply said that our collective action actually has to make a difference. Our collective action actually has to give us the country and the economy we deserve. One that's inclusive, one that's equitable, and one that continues to grow where everyone has an opportunity. An opportunity to live an economically sustainable life, an opportunity to thrive, to live in abundance, to be connected, to be healthy. This conversation we're having today is part of many conversations that we're having around business ownership, home ownership, investment behavior, because we understand that the capital is kind of key to all of this. And the behavior of capital either entrenches the systemic racism that we've all come to know, or it gives us an opportunity to do something different. In 2020, Living Cities launched what we called then the Closing the Gaps Year of Reckoning Cohort. Work with a cohort of cities to actually see what we could do on the ground. How do we actually have this conversation? How do we talk about racial equity with intentionality, but also think about policies and practices that maintain the barriers that we've come to know? Not an easy conversation. Now, the irony of this, or the serendipity, or the blessing of this moment, was that in 2020, all of a sudden, 22 million Americans who were trapped at home discovered racism. And we discovered it in a way that for me was very personal, because this kind of discovery, when I was coming up, was always, well, what did he do? That was the question. What did he do? He must have done something. But we all watched, and we all understood, and it became very personal. And 22 million plus Americans went to the street and said, we want something better. We're better than this. We aspire to more. The Year Reckoning Cohort has been having that conversation all along. And even now, when some people would think, well, that was a moment, we're done with that. Oh, just got a Supreme Court decision that suggests we should walk away from intentionality around race. Oh, is diversity a safe word in my company? Should I talk about equity? Oh, maybe we should reconfigure these policies so that, we're sort of colorblind and neutral. Even at that time, Living Cities has found ourselves saying, no, now is the time to actually be very clear about what we mean. To be clear about the data. To be clear about the evidence. Our partnership with the Urban Institute makes that a wonderful conversation. For those of you who are going to read the report, because you are going to read the report, correct? You are going to read the report, right? Okay, you're going to download and you're going to share it with lots and lots of people who don't know the data, right? Right? Oh, you got to, this church, I wish this was a praying church, but, right? Okay. And the reason we're going to do that is because at the end of the day, no matter what you label it, anti-poverty back in the 90s, marginalized community development, no matter what you label it, it has the same complexion. It's a complexion of exclusion. It's a complexion of othering. It's a complexion of systems that close doors to opportunities. And Sarah, your story of your family and homeownership, that is the story that every American wants to have a part of. And even though we have passed laws that say we no longer close doors, so many Americans find the doors closed. Sometimes they can't even find the door. We're here to have that conversation, and I'll close here and say, in 2045, we will be a multiracial, multi-ethnic plurality. We can no longer operate with the economic rules that privilege some over others. We know this. And we know that in cities where we are proximate, sometimes too proximate, we have to come to know one another, and we have to know that building opportunity for many begins with experimenting on the possible, demonstrating what's capable, but facing the data and facing the evidence of where we've been and where we still are today. With no further preaching from me, I want to invite Michael to come on up because we want to have a conversation around the data, the report, where we are. And I'll close on this. I was listening to this song in the Broadway play Hadestown. We build the wall. Why we build the wall. And it's a chilling kind of song. You know, our fear of poverty. And poverty has a face. And we build the wall. The work that the Urban Institute, Housing Finance Policy Institute, and Urban Institute itself is the work that actually helps us build the bridges, not just the wall. Michael, come on up, man. Let's do this. Now, if y'all didn't know this already, and I told Michael I was going to give a shout out to the team, okay, because I'm interviewing Michael, but this is work that Yannicka Ratliff, Caitlin Young, Daniel Pang, who's not listed, but all of those are the folks who actually made this report real. And we are going to read the report, right? And share it. Exactly. I told Michael, I said, listen, there's so much in this report. So much that, Lakeisha was giving me sort of summary points. It looked like a deposition. I said, okay, I'm not going to hit all those questions, Lakeisha. But Michael and I are just going to have a chat. And Michael, what I'm curious, and I hope you can share, is what is the history and the context of this report? And frankly, how does it help us understand the stratification we still exist with? Because I kept messing with you. I said, Michael, we had the laws passed in '68. Why are we still here?
First, let me just start by thanking you, by thanking Lakeisha, by thanking the Living Cities team, I think, for making visible a very important issue. You guys are certainly the ones that are out there fighting the good fight. And I appreciate it. I think we at the Urban Institute appreciate the work that you're doing. To kind of get to your question, I think we really have to step back here and, think fundamentally about how this country was founded. What did it mean to be an American? It meant a particular gender. It meant a particular race. It meant owning property. Those things wrapped up into your ability to participate in this grand experiment. And so that automatically starts to exclude people by exactly the dimensions that I've brought forward. But as the country has wrestled with this issue, you see it through slavery, through Jim Crow, Reconstruction, through redlining and racial covenants. Even today, as we move into, and you mentioned, the Supreme Court decision, but as we see the changes that are taking place in our economy, these issues remain at the forefront of who is able to benefit and who is not. And so, I think that there is this context, this backdrop of how this country has dealt with structural racism itself. But there's also, I think, this backdrop around wealth building. The Deputy Secretary talked about it, and President Sarah talked about it in terms of the role that homeownership plays. What does it mean to get a mortgage? What does it mean to have a down payment? What does it mean to build a home? And all of those kind of coming together in terms of ultimately informing what has historically been a key way to not just build wealth today, but also to pass on that wealth into the future. And I think there is an important story around that intergenerational wealth that does inform many of the wealth disparities that we see today.
At the risk of having this audience boo me, this all sounds like a private sector problem, and we heard from the Deputy Secretary. What role do you believe the federal government has to play, and frankly, what role does state government and local government have to play in closing the gaps that you started describing?
Yeah, every time you say the word gaps, it just reminds me of how deep and how long these disparities have been in place. Certainly I think that there is, you think about home ownership, I tend to approach it the way that an economist might, a microeconomist in particular, kind of around, demand and supply. The Deputy Secretary kind of alluded to this, that, when we're thinking about mortgage financing, we're really talking about levers that the federal government, that largely reside with the federal government. Certainly, when we think about scalability, when we think about the ability, the bullhorn, the platform, the ability to bring large groups of people together over large geographies, the federal government certainly kind of can play a critical role in solving these types of market failures. But, at the same time, there's certainly a role for state and local governments. What automatically comes to mind is when we turn over to the supply side. When we turn over to new construction. That's where we start to think about the levers around permitting, the levers around zoning, the levers around building codes, and other areas where state and local governments really do have strong policy levers. And so, what that then tells me is that it really is that it is about understanding the broader ecosystem. A large part of it are the people sitting out here and the two of us here on stage. We're a part of that ecosystem. But it's also about what are ways in which the federal government, with their particular skills and expertise and what they bring to the table, can marry with that bottom-up approach, that real understanding of what's going on the ground that state and local governments can offer in order to really optimize our ability to actually permanently close these racial gaps.
Understood. So you mentioned zoning. Here we go. You mentioned zoning. I'm curious, is this a space of innovation? Is this a space of sort of libertarian, like let's eliminate all of the zoning so that we can just have an open market?
Sure.
Or is this a place where there's an opportunity to be creative? I'm just curious how you see it.
I'm a big fan of Pulp Fiction. It's one of my favorite movies.
I love it.
And one of the things I love about Pulp Fiction...
Can I have a sip of your soda? No, let me stop. Let me stop.
One of the things I love about Pulp Fiction is the movie ends where it starts, right? In my mind, that's just so clever. And the reason I say that is because we're going to keep going back to this idea of certainly there's an important way of thinking about the world around economic disparities. But there's also an important role for the history and for the present day instances of structural racism, and zoning is one of those areas. Certainly there's a part of zoning that's around, where can we build houses, can we build them, and what kind of houses can we build in certain areas. But there's also a part of zoning that is rooted in who do we want to live in this space and who don't we. And zoning in that way is a tool of exclusion. And so, I do think, again, you think about zoning tool largely in the hands of local governments that we have seen in places around the country, including Minneapolis, where they have tried to use that tool to center equity as a way of driving more equitable outcomes. But at the same time, you turn around and you ask builders, well, what are the challenges that you face?
Right.
And they're going to tell you the 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever number of L's we're up to now, that these are our issues. And zoning typically is not in that top 3 or 4 list. And so I think that it's important, again, when we're talking about how do we bring the entire ecosystem together, this is another space where I think that that's critical.
Understood. You talked about builders. What I hear, and I think most of us hear, anyone who's starting to look for their first home, or this is a hot market. Everything's hot, and it's impossible now, right? I'm curious how, when you think about the availability of capital, think about mortgages, and you think about mortgage finance and access, and when Deputy Secretary talked about Blacks and Latinos going to FHA loans as the primary way, it gave me a bit of pause. It made me, I heard that as, well, the private market's not for you. It's not available to you. And even though I know FHA is tied to the private market specifically, but for this, we would not be in the game. I'm curious what role you believe capital and finance has to play in making sure that even if it's a hot market or it's a cool market or a warm market, that we still have a place. And when I say we, I'm talking about what we are now calling BIPOC people, right? Black, Indigenous, Latina, Asian American, and other people of color, right? I don't know who the other is, but I'm just going to say those characteristics of folks who've been often locked out. What do you think? What role does capital have to play here?
Yeah, no, so, let me say a couple things. Let me start off kind of on, you mentioned builders and capital, and certainly, housing, is a debt finance industry. I mean, it's a debt finance industry. I mean, it's like durable goods in that way, right. Automobiles and things like that. We're not just using debt on the demand side, we're also using debt on the supply side. But, it interacts, I think, with the longer term structural issues that we were kind of talking about around, builders keep telling us lack of land, lack of labor, lumber prices are high. And, those issues and their impact on the ability to bring new homes to market, gets amplified in a world in which pricing is higher and credit standards could be tighter. And so, you do run this kind of risk, I think, of that either resulting in less construction, or that those prices filter through in some way, ultimately to the consumer. And so, so I think that's first. And so when you think about, some of the issues, I think there's also a point around, not just capital, but who has the power and who has the control of that capital. So not just about the pipes in terms of who's flowing through it, but who controls that. And that's where I think a lot of issues around, a lot of potential conversations around, diversifying the industry. We know in the real estate industry, we're talking 80 to 90% white. And, that can have implications ultimately if there is evidence of racial prejudice. that can have implications in terms of where the capital ultimately gets directed. And so, you start to think about what are ways in which, we can encourage developers of color. We've seen that in many areas around the country as one other potential way of ensuring that capital is adequately dispersed. But let's step back just a little bit. When certainly the times that we're in are challenging ones around, pricing, certainly around higher interest rates. And that has a lot of implications, not just for who's able to get capital around affordability,
Right.
but also around the benefits of getting that capital in the first place. The way to think about that is if you're borrowing, to what degree is compounding working against you in such a way that you actually wind up owing more than maybe than the benefits that you're getting. Right. And so I think that it's really critical amid this kind of backdrop as we think about capital, which is so critical to the system, that we keep in mind not just who's being excluded, but even if people were able to obtain it, are they optimally benefiting from it? And if I say one more thing, it's that this does open up a conversation around whether or not capital should be central to the very way in which we allocate the resources of homeownership.
Here we go. So I know we have room for one more question, so I'm going to make this a tight one. We literally have 1 minute.
Okay. Knock it out.
The report speaks really, really creatively about climate change sustainability. Yeah. I'm curious, as you envision and you learn more about where that type of innovation is factoring into home building and home ownership, I'd love you to share your hope for that work segueing and blending well with what we're talking about today around home ownership finance and housing finance and just equity itself. I'm just curious how you blend those things.
Yeah. So certainly, I think that is a great way to end this conversation, because we're no longer looking to the past, we're no longer in the future, we're looking forward. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing. And when you look forward, certainly I think we have seen increasing evidence of disproportionate implications for communities of color, number one. But number two, we also know that it can have implications ultimately. We talked about interacting with other issues. We talked about the lack of supply. How do you marry affordability with resilience? We talked about demand mortgages. How do you marry pricing? How do you marry credit standards? How do you marry credit availability with the risks around particularly climate catastrophes? That being said, what makes me most hopeful is that we have eyes on the ball. The federal government is talking tremendously about it with a will to center government. Researchers are publishing reports with an eye toward centering the implications for people of color. And so those are two places where I feel hopeful in terms of driving and maintaining this conversation, again, to ensure that the progress that we wrote back when we did the Constitution, that we actually are able to realize that going into the future.
Michael, thank you for your energy.
Thank you.
Your colleagues for your brilliance.
Thank you.
And everybody's going to read this report and share this report.
Excellent.
Michael,
Excellent.
thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. I want to, at this time, invite my colleague and who I'm going to give her the following praise. Living Cities has been talking about communities and community development for many, many years. And only recently did we really dig into the idea of homeownership as a wealth building pathway. And I credit that to Lakeisha Fox. Come on board.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank y'all. Thank you, everyone, for coming and people tuning in somewhere out there in the webverse. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good. I'm Lakeisha Fox. I'm the Associate Director of Homeownership at Living Cities. And I'm so excited to be here to be able to talk about the incredible work we've been doing with cities across the country, focusing on closing racial wealth and income gaps. And today we're going to focus specifically on homeownership, but you heard Joe, we've been talking about inclusive capital, impact investing, business ownership, and all of the things. But today we're really trying to tackle this really important and complicated issue as we heard all the data and things about just now. So I'll give a little bit of background on the work we've been doing with cities, and then I'm really excited to let you hear from the amazing panel we've accumulated, attracted, welcomed here to hear from the panelists. So let me get to our slide. The CTG network, Living Cities has put together a network we've been working with a network of cities across the country, which we call the Closing the Gaps Network. And so the CTG network really represents a coalition of local government leaders that are really committed to reimagining what an anti-racist society might look like and playing an important role in shifting policies and programs and resources and operations to get us there. And so you heard from Joe, in 2020 we launched the Year of Reckoning cohort, which you'll see are the blue dots on the map. And within that cohort, we have Albuquerque, Austin, Memphis, who's also here in the room with us, Minneapolis, Rochester, New York, and St. Paul, who's also here with us. Representatives are here with us today, so please engage all of these amazing people and talk to them about this work at the reception. But behind us, you'll see all of the cities we've been working with across the country, and we're gonna be expanding to more cities soon, so keep an eye out for that. But in the 6 Year of Reckoning cohort cities, Living Cities has been partnering with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond to develop racial equity competencies and to provide undoing racism workshops. We've also provided secondary research and qualitative data through community-based needs assessments to really dig in and figure out, talking to community and local members on the ground to figure out what are the needs and what are the opportunities that exist there in the local ecosystem of homeownership and business ownership. And then, of course, our amazing partners at Urban Institute to give us the data to establish the baseline metrics of where the current status of homeownership and business ownership locally in those 6 cities. We've also provided with amazing technical assistance partners to provide and support the cities to create data-informed work plans and then to begin implementing those work plans around the issues that were uncovered in the data. And finally, we subgranted over $3.2 million to support their plans and implementation of this work. And I just want to highlight, as we talked about, as you heard Joe mention, our collective action, our collective collaborative, Living Cities is a collaborative. We really do try to carry that out in all of our work. And so I see this work with cities as true collective action. You know, the work that these cities are doing on the ground is really the importance of data-driven strategies, the power of collective action, and the commitment to dismantling racial disparities. And so just want to share a little bit about the work we've been doing over the last 3 years, and then turn it over to the cities to hear more from them. And to send well wishes to Angela Rollins. We had another rep that was supposed to join us from the city of Rochester who couldn't make it, so sending her our well wishes, and also, to let you know, there's a QR code on your table, so please start sending in your questions now because we will have time for that at the end. Okay, let's hear from y'all. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Please introduce yourself to this amazing group of people and give us a little bit of background on why and how you're furthering homeownership for Black and brown folks in your city, and why is that important? Anybody?
Go first. Okay. Thank you, Lakeisha. Thank you, Living Cities and Urban Institute. My name is Michelle Melendez. I'm the director of the City of Albuquerque's Office of Equity and Inclusion. It's an office that was established 5 years ago by Mayor Tim Keller when he was first elected. Didn't exist before, so everything we do is innovating. And I really appreciated Joe talking about the investments that Living Cities has made that help us to experiment, to solve some of our city's biggest challenges. I would say that the way that we're furthering Black and Native American homeownership in specific, because that's what the data showed, have the lowest rates of homeownership in our city. We're a state that has the 4th largest Native American population in the nation, and so we really center Native American issues every chance that we have to close those gaps. The way that we're doing it is, I would say, very much creating and identifying a market of Black and Native American homeowners, because we know that all families want to own their home if they can, and then involving those communities very, very deeply in the imagination of what kind of a community they would like, what kind of homes, and not just in what the homes might look like in the neighborhood and the community. That's the funnest part, but also in how do we get there from here? How do we finance? And we're really turning everything on its head in terms of how do we make the financing fit what emerges from our community collaborative envisioning process, rather than the other way around, if it can be done. And that's what we will find out. But I'm no home developer, right? But what I've learned just coming into this work is that the city typically identifies land or other subsidy that it may have to encourage affordable home development, and leverages LIHTC and all those kinds of instruments, and really asks developers through an RFP, here's land, here's money, what can you do for us? And that has produced about 200 affordable rental units per year in Albuquerque. We have a very deep gap in affordable rental, much less homeownership, and has done nothing to really close the generational wealth gap, or excuse me, the racial wealth gap that's generational wealth. So what we're trying to do is explore different things that aren't necessarily new, but new to some of us doing this work in a racially conscious way. Things like co-op ownership, things like a 2-generation strategy in which it could be set up like a real estate investment trust, where we are giving kids like baby bonds and then putting that money into a trust and then using that trust to help fund the gap for a housing development. So the kids being the investors that we needed to close that gap. Because we recognize that the home buyers themselves are bringing most of the money to the table, and the city's role is to find that financing for the gap. Things like that, or other bonding type of instruments. But the most important thing to us is to continue centering home ownership and closing the racial wealth gap, because the impetus in the city is to build more rental units because we're so far behind.
I guess we're going this way.
Okay, sounds good.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Smith, and I am the former director of the Performance Management and Innovation Department for the City of Minneapolis. So I'm not working in a jurisdiction. Quit in May. But live in cities, who somehow gets their hooks in me for every initiative that they do, called while I was at the city, and I decided that, this probably wouldn't be a surprise to many people. And Michael said it when he was here speaking, and that is, federal government, county, state, city, and townships, all those jurisdictions, while you have people in those jurisdictions who are trying to solve problems for closing the gaps, many of those people who are trying to solve those problems are not at a high level within those jurisdictions. And quite frankly, a lot of those jurisdictions are responsible for where we are now and somewhat complicit in perpetuating it today. And so I decided that it wouldn't be the best use of Living Cities' money and resource to give that money to a city who already has resources and aren't really addressing the problem, but to give it to an organization who I know to be serious about the work, have an excellent reputation, but they also focus their efforts on young people. And from my experience in the city and technical assistance programs and everything that helps people around housing, if you go to those places, home ownership seminars and things like that, the average age is really like between late 30s and early 50s. And so we wanted to concentrate on young people so that we're not always playing this game of catching up. And so what we've decided on, well, what the young people decided on, because it's not us old folks who did it, is that they want to do home ownership, but they don't want to do it in a traditional way. They're not in it for as much money as they can get out of it. They would prefer a cooperative model, which also incorporates entrepreneurship so that you can have mixed use housing. They can own the units as a share and as a cooperative, and that you can have anchor tenants in the form of the entrepreneurs that can also help to sustain the co-op and keep the costs low. And so that's what we're doing in the city of Minneapolis with this project with Living Cities, and we've acquired, well, not acquired, we're close. We have an LOI, and we're working out an agreement to purchase some land, which is probably about
4 acres?
about 3.5, 4 acres in a neighborhood that's actually on the cusp of being gentrified heavily. But we have an opportunity to make sure that young people from this community, other residents that currently reside in the community can actually build what we're calling really a village that will have housing, that will have daycare, that will have a clinic, grocery stores, and you name it. And that way, this neighborhood can see everything and enjoy all the amenities and everything that the people 1 block south of them are having an opportunity to enjoy. But the cooperative model is one that's going to permeate the entire project. Youth Prize will, put the capital stack together and things like that. And I'll help with that because when I quit, I do have a job. So I'm the founder and CEO of Fortis Capital, and am contracting with Youth Prize to help put the capital stack together and everything else with the development. But we want to make sure that we're having a conversation with people who want to do barbershops, restaurants, all those things as a part of this campus, and they will all be owners of it. Youth Prize will just be the primary at we'll always keep about 51%. So that way you have somebody who has assets, somebody who has resources and access to resources, who can always be there to help people and make sure that they don't fall apart and fall under. And so with the technical assistance that we're getting from Living Cities and the supports that we're getting from people that, because of the role that I had, this is the path that we're on, and we plan to be successful. I don't hope for it. We plan to be successful.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Hasso. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm serving as the interim equity officer for the city of Austin, Texas. Yeah, I don't know if y'all know, but we're in a very extreme affordability crisis in Austin. A lot of, or I don't know, some folks I guess refer to us as the Southern Silicon Valley, so a lot of tech headquarters there. And so that has brought in a huge population boom, and with that, a lot of wealth. But of course, that wealth has been really, there are huge gaps. And so the people of color in our communities have been forced to relocate in a lot of instances. So displacement is a huge issue. Homelessness is a huge issue, a growing issue. And so we're really thankful to be in this partnership. And I see our role with the city in a lot of ways as an opportunity to create relationships with directly impacted community members and organizations. And I see the biggest thing that we can do in a lot of ways is get out of the way. And so we're lucky to be able to work with Living Cities and an organization that is aligned with our principles and values, and bringing in the People's Institute was really important in this way because they really allowed us to kind of focus on the strength-based approach that we're already using in other programs through the Equity Office and throughout the city. And so we are partnering with Up Together, which is a national nonprofit, to administer direct cash assistance to folks. And this is also in collaboration with our city's housing team, and our Austin Housing Finance Corporation and their community land trust program. So we are working with 13 families specifically to give them direct cash assistance, unrestricted cash on a monthly basis for a period of time. And these 13 families, the majority of them have closed on their homes. A few will be closing at the end of October. And this is really as a way to sort of help stabilize them as they make this huge purchase. It's all families of color. And because it's unrestricted, we don't know exactly what they're going to spend it on, but we will be tracking that. And what we've seen in other direct cash assistance programs in the city that we've been administering is that the majority of folks spend it on housing, whether it's rent or in some other capacity. And so we think this is a really good match too, because we want folks to have, not have to spend all of their money on their mortgage, and to be able to kind of stay in place as time goes on with this expense. Because housing in Austin, we talked a lot about zoning earlier, and I think that's really significant. We're having all sorts of conversations around our land development code and how we haven't had a land development code update since the 80s. And I think we have to fill in these kinds of gaps with programming. And for us, the people who are closest to the problem usually have the best solutions. And so for us, this was really about getting out of the way and getting money to folks as quickly as possible. This is a 2-year program, and so in the second year, we're also going to be working with a community development corporation in a community that has, if not the highest, one of the highest populations of people of color, but they are also the most rapidly gentrifying tract in the city. And so most folks are at risk of displacement there, and so we're going to be kind of building capacity with the CDC through this project as well.
So this was not on the list of questions, but because of the work that you're all doing, and you all mentioned it, right? Cooperatives, land trusts, really listening to the community. That was something you all touched on, listening to the community to inform the plans. And of course, looking at the data to see what was needed. Living Cities is also really thinking about community land trusts and what are the barriers there and how can we support more of that work and support communities on the ground to really own more, because ownership, we know, is power, right? We heard Michael and Joe talking about that. What do you think, how did that happen? I think, and there's another city, Memphis, there is definitely another city, Memphis and St. Paul, I think are doing something around cooperative models, land trust models. And so just, if you had to proffer, why is that such a thing that's coming up for all of the communities when we talk to them about what do they really want? And we know there's pushback also, right, when you talk about land trust, because it's a shared equity model, or cooperatives because of the shared equity. But why do you think that the data and the community led you to decide to do something around shared ownership?
Well, I think for us in Albuquerque, one, it makes it permanently affordable. So it's a solution that's a systemic solution. And two, the promise of land trusts is it helps people who otherwise could not afford to get into a house to be able to get in, because the upfront costs would be less. What they're actually financing is less. And although they won't get as much out in the end, if they end up selling, it gets them in. And so the sales is that you get into a house that you can afford, and it's a nice house, and it's going to be in a neighborhood that's with other homeowners. There's all kinds of pros to it, and it gets you into a house that you could never afford without such a model.
Well, land trust models, there's pros and cons to a lot of things. And land trusts have been good for, again, getting people that first opportunity to be able to have some sort of ownership. And it also is a way, if you have a land trust, to purchase properties pretty cheap. But traditionally, land trusts have been, for the most part, white-owned nonprofit organizations that have acquired a lot of land in poor black and brown neighborhoods. And the executive directors make nice salaries, their staff make nice salaries, but the equity is the ownership in the land, which is the most important thing, is what ends up staying with that organization. And then if you have a unit or a house or something like that, you're only able to walk away with so much equity when you do walk away, because they're trying to keep it perpetually affordable. And so the pros of that are you get a chance. The cons of it is that this land banking is now not happening with communities who have, where we're trying to close the gap. And so it's not really addressing that. And so if the land trust is owned by people in the neighborhood, the same cooperative model around the land trust exists. If the same cooperative model that we say about the actual houses were actually existing in the makeup of the land trust, then it would make sense to me, more sense. And so we're trying to kind of stay away from the land trust model, but again, I see the pros and cons, and what we're trying to do is, though Youth Prize will have a majority stake in the property to start, each year we'll relinquish more and more of the percentage of the property to the cooperative owners in the buildings, in the different phases that we're building, so that Youth Prize will still be there as a supporter and a backer, but the cooperative ownership actually lives with the people in the neighborhood, because Youth Prize can hop up and go somewhere else and do it again, hop up somewhere else and go and do it, because it's about creating a sustainable, perpetual model for us and not about wealth building for Youth Prize. And so that's what we're attempting to do, and with the technical assistance that we get from Living Cities, we're taking young people through the different co-op models, because they want a co-op, but we're taking them through the co-op models and training so that they understand and building that curriculum. And then phase 2 will be the development part of it. So we want them to understand the development part of it so that they can not just be homeowners, but if they, as a group, find some land, a couple acres somewhere, that they understand the process and how to do it and don't just rely on us, but they can do it themselves. And so we're being aggressive, we're being pretty hopeful, but that's the way we're doing it. So I know that's a long answer to how I feel about land trusts, but now you don't have to ask me a question when I get off the stage.
I largely feel the same way. I think in Austin, because it's really hard to keep families and lower income families, families of color in the city limits, land trust has been like one model that has kind of worked or has helped get folks be able to have like some sustainable housing in a city that is just really unaffordable. It would be hard even to find like an apartment to house a family in the city center at this time. And so land trusts have kind of have filled like a small gap in that way for us. But yeah, I agree. I mean, land ownership and equity is so much of the wealth building that we need that we're not really getting able to address right now through this. But because ours is a city, and I think as a, in transportation and land use, equitable transit-oriented development is such a big thing right now. Being able to keep folks who need the services the most, who could benefit the most from connected cities in the actual city, is really something that we want to focus on. So.
Thank you. We have some questions coming in from online and from the room, so I'm going to read a couple of these, and then we can go back. But so oftentimes rentals are pitted against homeownership. So rental housing is pitted against homeownership when it comes to policy support. And for many years, homeownership was an issue that was hands-off for elected officials because homeownership was attainable. What are you learning that works best to get homeownership on the top of mind for local policymakers?
You haven't gone.
Honestly, I think it might be a little different in Austin or in Texas as a whole. Homeownership is a really big issue, a policy issue, and often we're trying to, advocate, and city government is like not the best word to use, but we are really trying to uplift renters in a lot of ways and try to get like our city officials to think about renters. But in this case, I think even talking about the racial wealth gap is and tying that to homeownership is more of a new thing, to be able to explicitly talk about the data, and to show like how Black folks in Austin own less housing now than they did in 2018, just 5 years ago. And so I think being able to tell the story in that way has been impactful. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Anything you want to add?
I guess I would say it's a challenge to have it top of mind. It's a strong value in Albuquerque and New Mexico as a whole, and I think we're a little different from the rest of the country in terms of the Hispanic home ownership rate. It's up there in the 68%, and I've got some hypotheses on why that is because of our history, but I really would need Michael Neal to help me make the argument for our policymakers that without home ownership, you really have an economic drag on your entire economy. And you need that, you need to be able to have homeowners to be able to do all the other things. It's a stability issue. It's an access to being able to borrow against. There's lots of reasons why a city should be very involved in promoting home ownership among people who can't just do it without some assistance. The racial wealth gap is a huge one. The other is that at the rate that the city is supporting that right now. So our city provides CDBG funds for $50,000 max down payment assistance for qualifying applicants. But those people have to qualify. So that cuts that dimension right there. And 50,000 won't get you the house. So there's still a gap. With today's rates of the new construction, $200 a square foot, you cannot build a house for what you can borrow, what you can afford to borrow at 90% of AMI. So, we're trying to close a gap and we're putting money towards that, but it must be helping people who are already at the upper limits of that. So we're not touching those who should be able to benefit from those kinds of subsidies. I think they're being left out. Right. So that's the equity argument for it, is who benefits and who is burdened by this.
Right.
So Lakeisha, so I never argue to get home ownership to be at the top of mind for legislators, but I do argue to try to get affordable housing, whether that's in a house or an apartment, to be at top of mind for legislators. And I think, and I'm sure it could be a long policy debate, but I believe that we've been trained that home ownership is the key to wealth building. It's almost like an oxymoron, going to debt to build wealth. And so I'll just let that sit with people for a while. And so the thing that I try to bring it to top of mind for legislators, if it is about home ownership, is in order to close this gap that we're talking about, you have to do the very same thing for other people that you did to create the gap in the first place. Yep. So either low interest loans, very low interest loans, or no interest loans, huge down payment. Where we have to get, the GI Bill that didn't work or we couldn't use, put some more on that. Like if it was worth $20,000 then, make it worth 60 or 70 or 100,000 now. So those things that were given to certain people in our society that others were left out of, and some people might think, oh man, that's a giveaway of this, that, and the other. But if anybody in here knows anything about medicine, and I know very little, medicine is nothing but poison administered in the proper doses. And so if you see it as a reverse discrimination, or if you see it as this, or if you see it as that, regardless of what you call it, if you administer it in the right doses, then some healing can take place. And right now, I can't advocate for just home ownership at 7%.
Oh, yeah.
and things like that. And so I think we have to look at all the options on the table as opposed to just this debt equity as a wealth building thing.
Right. And, yes, interest rates are ridiculous right now, and they aren't coming down anytime soon. But data does show, and it showed in all 6 of your cities, that folks are more cost burdened, especially Black and brown people on the ground that are renters than are homeowners. Now, of course, they are already homeowners, and so that was probably when the interest rates weren't at 7%. But, I mean, if we could get creative about interest rates and other ways, as you're saying, to provide more flexibility and more cushion for people to not have to be paying those costs, we know that homeownership is affordable housing. And so it is important that people have the choice if they want to do that, because rents are just going up, up, up every year too. We know that, right? Landlords are, raising prices every chance they get, and speculators and investors are buying property all over the country, and especially in Black and brown neighborhoods, because they know that that's where it's still affordable and it's about to possibly flip, the gentrification. And so, so thank you all for that. We know this work is hard, right? Homeownership, all the complications, all the factors that we know are in the report that everyone's going to read. Thank you, Joe. And racial equity, right? Like, these are issues that are not able to be solved overnight. They're really hard. And we've been with you, Living Cities has, on this journey to really think about this and to address this. Could you share with the audience, like what that has been like? What has this journey been like for you? And especially from where you sit, because you're not in the homeownership or the housing departments in your city.
Yeah, I think it's been wonderful to be able to connect with folks in other cities, and even with folks who are situated in states that aren't as restrictive as Texas. I think we all still have similar challenges, even if the circumstances are different. We're definitely in a snapback period, right, of when we try to talk about racial equity and move the needle on racial equity or doing anything that's anti-racist intentionally, there's a lot of fear right now. And I think being part of a cohort where we can all kind of share in that experience has been really helpful. I think I've learned that we are expected to be very cross-functional in our roles within equity offices without not a lot of the technical knowledge around housing, for instance, or land use. And so I've been gaining a much broader knowledge base around that work, probably, kind of spurred by this work. And so GARE, also the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, right now has a land use and a housing work group that I've been a part of, and that has been really helpful for me as well in this work and connecting it to this work. And so, yeah, I've been really thankful for that, and I think it's given some validation in a very tumultuous time. We have new leadership in our city that is kind of taking us back a bit. And so we're having to make the case for racial equity in everything across all systems. And so, yeah, I think, being able to be with other cities who can kind of add to that toolkit is really helpful.
Yeah, I would just co-sign on that. It strengthens our position to be part of a large network, and the long-term commitment that Living Cities has made also makes it so that it's furthered the commitments that our own city made in 2020. So I would characterize this cohort in 2020 and forward as the kind of confluence of 2 pandemics. So one, COVID, obviously, and the other has been the racism pandemic that we have been silently dealing with for a very long time. But during COVID, at the height of it at the beginning, we really centered racial equity in our city in terms of where should the resources be deployed. The emergency rental assistance, the food resources, all the essential workers, all the people who couldn't work from home, and I was in the office in the Emergency Operations Center when our main message was stay home, work from home. And it's there's a bunch of people who cannot follow that instruction. So we have just really taken the resources, the trainings and others, and to be able to keep putting a stake in the ground, to keep pushing for racial equity. So if it was good during COVID, when we were fighting that battle, and still are in many ways, and using up together to give cash disbursements to people who didn't qualify for the stimulus. So everyone was like, hey, everyone's got a stimulus, they're gonna make it. And it's like, well, there's a bunch of people who are being left out completely because of immigration status, because of other factors. So all of that has helped lay a foundation for having these racial equity discussions so that we don't lose ground, and potentially we can take these arguments into arenas like homeownership instead of just, I don't mean just, but we're not just talking about emergency resource deployment. Now, how do we deploy a city's resources to address the racial inequities?
Nothing else.
Just like my big brother Joe, I don't have a whole bunch to say about that. We know the work that we're doing, who is intended to help. That's not going to change. But the reason that I left the city of Minneapolis is because people can use all the terms. They can write them down. They can say it at a microphone. But there was no evidence to suggest that they were serious about it. And so I left. If they're watching it, but I still know enough and have enough relationships with people there to make the wheels at planning and development, zoning, and all those places turn for what we want to do. But I could not try to get good work done and fight that fight every day and keep my sanity and stay physically healthy. And so I'm grateful for Living Cities for, being serious about this and bringing resources, time, energy, and a reputation to the table to help us get this done. But it's exhausting.
Yeah. Thank y'all. Thank you for sharing that. Michelle, this next question is probably just for you. How are you partnering with, or are you partnering with, I know a little bit, so I'm saying, how are you partnering with your local transportation department, and what are the transportation considerations in the work you're doing?
Well, in a couple of different ways. Our office as a whole, not related necessarily to the homeownership aspect, has been a longtime partner with community organizers and community-based organizations that are pushing for equitable access to zero fares. So our city has zero fares, and it's about 2 years now, and it was a big fight, and every year during budget time it's challenged. But the idea that we're going to go back to charging people, I think that idea has passed. So we've been big advocates for zero fares and for language access and all the things that would make access to our transportation system more equitable. Now, in addition to that, we have applied for and been selected for a Thriving Communities grant from DOT to help focus on a particular area of our city to help create more complete transit equity-oriented neighborhoods. And so it's really deep in the city core, and it's an underserved area that is, now it's being marketed as like a destination, and it could gentrify. So, but the neighborhoods around it that are historically low-income Hispanic neighborhoods don't have great access to transit right now. So what we're gonna hope to do is create more walkable neighborhoods in that area, connectivity between the neighborhoods, and then microtransit, I guess, is the term that's being used. So like, if I recall correctly, our office or our transit department is talking about almost like an Uber for that area that's transit oriented and run by transit.
Nice. Okay. How do you ensure the conversation and policies related to housing development are focused on the building of affordable housing for homeownership? Power and focus seem to be centered on single family and rentals. And, some single families may not be as affordable as we talked about, right? The cost of building and everything. And so some of more of that missing middle, more of the condo or the bungalows or duplexes, right? How do you ensure in local government that the conversation and policies related to housing development are focused on building more affordable types of homeownership options?
Yeah, for us, we've really had to think about how we're actually defining affordable and like affordable for whom. So we talk a lot about how, I mean, a lot of our programs are 80% MFI below, which is in Austin, I think about 93,000 for a family of 4. But the folks we work with, they're like at 30% below. And so we're still really missing that piece. And getting, political will around being able to have intentionally focused programs or housing policies. That's a whole, I don't know that we're close to being able to get there, but even to be able to readjust our program so that we're actually focused on deeply affordable housing is something that is just constantly ongoing and that we're always trying to center in our work. But I think when we're trying to use the data to inform that, that's when we're kind of met with that pushback around, well, we can't, be explicit about race, but then we're seeing our very race neutral programs in our city not performing well. So our down payment cash assistance program, the majority of folks we help are white in that program.
Because the costs, right? That was one of
Because
the things.
it's very expensive.
pay.
Yeah, you have to pay. And also if we're not using race as a factor in it, it's easier, it's harder to be more intentional, and we don't necessarily put a lot of time and resources into doing that. Yeah. So the conversation around what affordability actually even is in Austin right now is, I think, constantly evolving.
On the policy front in Albuquerque, we weren't a huge part of it, but played a role. Our city, through our mayor and the planning department and the Office of Policy, just did away with R1 zoning. So that was a feat, and it won't translate immediately into more affordable units, but it removes a giant barrier, and the fights against it that happened at City Council were using the language that we all know as code. So basically that allowing other than single-family homes will change the character of our neighborhoods. And so doing away with that is a very good first step. This zoning change also made ADUs, or accessible dwelling units, and casitas, as we call them, permissible uses in almost every part of the city. And so we also know that won't immediately result in dozens or hundreds of those without some creative financing for people of color. But on the policy front, just within the past few months, we've at least created the policy environment that will help enable some of those future developments.
And Minneapolis was the first city in the country, right? Back in, was that 2018 now?
Claps for the plan.
Yeah, the plan.
So the plan, and that was done by the Long Range Planning Department, which is a Department of Planning and Economic Development, CPED. So they did a fabulous job of working with community members and state partners and county partners to pass the 2040 plan that Michael gave reference to. It is, if implemented, fabulous. I did not play a role in the development, but the performance and innovation team supported long-range planning with some of the outreach and putting together meetings and making sure that we could support them in any way we could. And after a lot of work, a lot of strenuous work, they passed that plan. And I remember being in meetings with national representatives from the real estate lobby and organizations, as well as wealthy homeowners in different parts of our city. And as the mayor and all of us were sitting in these meetings and we were talking about what we were going to do, people were saying things I'm rarely shocked. I'm used to coded language. But they would just say, how are you going to do this? We have a covenant with you, and you are not supposed to be allowing these types of dwellings in our neighborhoods. I'm like, are they they saying this out loud? And I was, sometimes I think I'm a little crazy, so I was like, maybe I'm just hearing things. But so once it passed, these same people who couldn't win the argument legally then took the plan to court. And so that's why nothing much has been done. Took the plan to court and said stuff about environmental stuff and ducks and birds, and if you build, we won't be able to see our birds anymore, and all these, strange things that they never cared about before. And so I would encourage people to do that work. And I just don't know how you get ahead of the racism that's inherent in so many things that we have in this country. I don't know how you get ahead of it when you do such a great job like our planning department did and still face this thing where it was passed 5 years ago and we still haven't built anything around our density related to that plan. And you still have, anyway, that.
Yeah. Ducks. Ducks are more important than people having a home.
Of course.
It's been interesting in Austin because I think we did something not similar to the plan. I mean, we have a lot of plans that are like really beautiful, but the implementation phase is like where everything dies. But we also, I'm going to say we eliminated single family zoning, but that's not correct. Really, it's not, they didn't take away that zoning. It's just that it's making it easier for like vertical mixed use to go up. And so there have been like these unlikely alliances happening with wealthier, whiter folks in these single family neighborhoods, kind of becoming bedfellows with lower income BIPOC communities who have really struggled to like hold on to the single family homes that they've actually been able to acquire despite all of the odds. And so there's this fear, with the incentives to developers that displacement is just going to get accelerated in these lower income communities. And so I think it's just like such a complicated conversation to have because we have to have those guardrails if we're going to eliminate certain types of zoning. What are we putting in place to protect the people who are already living in these neighborhoods who are barely holding on in a lot of instances and are multi-generational.
Complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. In addition to baby bonds, which was mentioned, what are some other wealth building policy solutions that could further equitable homeownership? Or not policy, because it could be
Let's talk
program.
about banks then.
Let's talk about banks.
Joe, not your partners. not the partners that
There's
live in
banks
cities.
in the room.
No, so banks have a huge role to play in this. Number one, they benefit the most from the mortgage in the first place. They benefit the most. But when it comes to how you invest in certain communities, and we talked about this about a week and a half ago, that the CRA credits, which allow people to reinvest in certain neighborhoods, need to be, that policy needs to be revised. Because you want investment in poorer neighborhoods. You for sure want that. But those investments aren't tied to the people who are poorest in those neighborhoods. And so if you have a Community Reinvestment Act where I can get credits for going into North Minneapolis or which part of Albuquerque? South Broadway or East Austin. If I'm already there, but then, Ann Willoughby decides, that's my fictional name for the white woman, decides to come into the neighborhood, just my fictional name. And she can get a loan, and she can have stuff for her business, her development, and things like that when she decides to come into that neighborhood. Then you get CRA credit for that neighborhood, but the people who've been there, who've been poor, stay poor. And so I get to get my CRA credit, but I actually get to exacerbate the problem the reason why we created the CRA credit in the first place. And so I think that's something that will go a long way when it comes to development especially mixed-use development, so that people can not just build a house or a fourplex or a sixplex or things like that, or some condos, but you can actually do the mixed-use development so that people can become entrepreneurs, get help with that. And most of these tracks are actually in transportation nodes, so you actually get even more money if you're on, a transportation avenue where you got buses and bus rapid transit or trains. But the credit goes to the neighborhood and not the actual people there. And so that's how you can see when neighborhoods like rapidly gentrify. And you're like, how's this bank getting their CRA credits? But that's how they do it. And so I would encourage, as a policy change, people to push their banks, for Living Cities to push the banks, for all of us to push the banks and say, hey, we need to revisit this so that this can be a more meaningful policy that's actually impacting people in the way we want it to. That's just one thing. I ain't get you in trouble with that. Sorry, Joe.
Anything else y'all want to add?
No, that's why I came, to meet people, to learn what other opportunities there are.
No? Okay. So one last question I think we have time for. And it's perfect because the question that came in online was similar to our question that I had that I wanted to close with. Collective action is key, right? That's what Living Cities is all about. We know that we can't do anything in this work, true systems change work, without collective action. And so, we have philanthropy in the room and online watching us. We have lenders, we have regulators, we have advocates, academia. I think anybody federal government, local government, right? Anyone who wants to solve the homeownership gap should be listening to this program right now, because everybody in this room, or be here so you can meet us all, we can talk together right after this, how we're gonna do it. But this is the room to be in if you wanna solve that issue. And so any final words, any call to action, what do you want them to know? What is your biggest question for them? What would be helpful when you think about, especially the sustainability of this work?
I think I would say that moment that we're in, where so many of these different sectors that you've just described want to do something for equity, now is the time to put your money where it can go and to really follow the community, because that's where we get the ideas, is from what our community says they want. And so really, in a way, the banks, the lenders, the other sectors are leveraging the community and not the other way around. The community has assets, the community has ideas, and is the one that stands to gain the most by closing those gaps. So if you want to participate in that, join with the community to make it happen.
And anything for HUD or Fannie or Freddie who are actually in the room that you would say?
Approve cash assistance now.
Yeah.
Cash for rent.
Yes.
Ditto.
But for the purposes of this gathering, like Living Cities, and I said this, when were y'all in Minneapolis?
In August?
We had a bunch of
for a site visit?
local philanthropy, and the only outside philanthropy of sorts was Living Cities. And I've said to people over and over again in the state of Minnesota that those philanthropic organizations should be ashamed of themselves to a degree, because Living Cities, as a partner on the East Coast, has come in and leveraged their relationships, their money, personal relationships, professional, policy relationships to help in an area where they don't even live. And they continue to do that. And so for the people in the room now, if you have resources, if you want to listen to people around policy issues related to this, I say resource Living Cities, because they know how to get it to the right people and they listen. And they listen to us around policy issues and really try to push it. And so if proximity and being proximate is important, they are. And they're not paying me to do this. I don't get a dime from Living Cities. And the money I did get was at a high interest rate. No, but
That was the capital team. I want to be clear. That was not closing the gaps. It was a grant.
No, but they do listen, and they're very serious about the work. And so if you're gonna, capitalize anyone, if you're gonna listen to anyone around policy decisions, because we can't be everywhere, we work in our jurisdictions, but they're everywhere. Fund them and listen to them, because they are really serious about listening and getting at solutions, and not just navel gazing and adoration of the question and making money off of asking the same question 20 different ways. And so that would be a suggestion that I would make. And then for HUD and Fannie, and put as much money into assistance as you do into asking people the questions that have been asked over and over again. Because I know there's a lot of money to say, well, what's the problem? We know what the problem is. And that's not a diss, but it's a serious statement about put resources where they're needed. And what people need is money, because things aren't affordable right now.
Yeah, our needs have been assessed to death. And so I think trusting the people with a capital P, community with a capital C, the people who are the closest to the problem, who are the most directly impacted by our inequities and unaffordability. They've been screaming the solutions, the answers to the questions for a long time. And so I think the strengths-based approach too, and how we think about our programming is really important. I think sometimes we approach things through a deficit mindset. And I think Michelle was saying earlier, like our communities have so much to bring to the table. And we're always kind of looking at what the lack is and how we can invest in ways that we think are the best ways to invest without really being led by community members. And so we try to flip that within the city, but we're one office in a large bureaucratic organization in a very red state. And so I think kind of working close with municipalities that have great relationships with community members is a way to go.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so
y'all.
much. That's it. And now, I'm sorry, because I was about to forget my job. I'm supposed to announce we have a 15-minute break, I'm being told, 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for our federal government panel.
on your hip.
But I see,
Does it
you're
bother
really
you?
skinny. Like, you can do that, put it on your hip. I'm like, there are roles
It's
that
all in how you,
happen.
it's all in how you suck it and tuck it.
Okay, there we go. I just like,
Oh,
So if we could just invite everybody to take your
I'm
seat.
telling you, this is trouble. Sorry, Jonica.
Or maybe you want to take a new seat and meet a new person in this room full of very talented and thoughtful people.
colleagues is here.
Great, thank you so much. I am just delighted to be here. My name is Rekha Balu. I am Director of Federal Equity Initiatives here at the Urban Institute, and I lead research for our Office of Race and Equity Research. And so as you can imagine, hearing the very rich conversation today has been incredibly stimulating and exciting, precisely because this isn't just about barriers, but also about solutions. And so we were just delighted when we were able to get these talented people from Fannie, Freddie, and HUD to come and talk to us about how they are explicitly tackling these challenges of and the barriers that you just heard about today to the homeownership gap, but really have used the instruments that are at their disposal as federal agencies and within the federal government, particularly very detailed equity action plans and setting of clear equity commitments, to identify what might be strategies that not only they, but the entire sector and all of the groups represented today could be pursuing to solve this challenge. And of course, it is not up to any one agency to solve this alone, just like it's not up to any one community or any one organization, as we heard from our previous panel, to solve this alone. So part of what we'll talk about today is kind of what does that ecosystem look like, and where might we enlist all of you. So just by way of introduction, we have Dimitri McCain, who's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thank you so much for making time today, and what is admittedly a busy schedule. And we've got Katrina Jones, who's Vice President of Racial Equity Strategy and Impact at Fannie Mae, and Pamela Perry, Vice President of Single Family Equitable Housing at Freddie Mac. So we couldn't ask for a better panel of more knowledgeable people and more committed people to join us in this conversation. So we just heard from our colleagues in other cities about a range of strategies that they were adopting within their respective cities to think through this challenge. But you all are operating at this national level where you've got lots of variation in what's happening in different states, and not just between states, but even between communities within states and within communities themselves. And curious, how are you then thinking about what is your approach to tackling those barriers? So, Pamela, maybe I'll start with you. I think there's been, I think single-family housing is something that we know has been elusive for some time for communities of color. What are some of the specific barriers to that you've tried to name and prioritize Freddie's resources to address?
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I was very excited from the last panel. It's nice to hear from folks on the ground doing things from a very different perspective than the perspective that I navigate every day in the secondary market for housing finance. And so the challenges that I'm addressing as a secondary market participant, and what I guess I would say that we are addressing, and by we I mean Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the Federal Housing Finance Agency, is dealing with what are the barriers in the housing finance system over which we have control. And so we don't originate mortgages, as all of you know. We provide liquidity to lenders who originate mortgages. But we also all know the realities on the ground are that the primary market originates the mortgages that we are willing to purchase. And so we set the standards that determine the mortgages, or many of the mortgages that get made in this country, and then we provide the liquidity to those for those mortgages. And as such, the system as it's currently working, or certainly as it was, we've had some impact in the last 3 years that I've been in this role, but that impact is small. I'm proud of the impact that we've made, but it is in fact small, and there is so much more work to be done, not just by us, but by all of us. And that's really key. And so I guess I would say that what we've tackled to date are really what I would view as the low-hanging fruit. We all know that the single largest impediment to achieving first-time homeownership is the lack of cash to close, the lack of cash to get into your first single-family home purchase. And so there are a lot of different pieces of that equation in terms of all those different costs that add up to that cash needed to close on a mortgage. And so they are the obvious things for us to tackle first. And I really think it's important to say this is what we're tackling first. How can we tackle the challenges of each of those incremental pieces? How can we make the loan origination process itself more efficient, to lower the costs of originating an individual mortgage loan? How can we address the challenges of down payment assistance to help first-time homeowners, particularly low wealth first-time homeowners, and most borrowers of color are in fact low wealth and do not have family and generational wealth upon which to rely to achieve first-time homeownership. And so we're doing that through a variety of ways. I don't want to talk too long. I don't remember what the course of the questions is that we have here today. But we are tackling that in a number of ways, and I'll just touch upon it and allow others to talk, and hopefully it'll wind back to me at some point. But we had a lot of federal policies and private policies in this country that created the white middle class in this country. In the 1950s, white post-war families achieved homeownership through a variety of very intentional programs that allowed them to get into their first-time homes without needing a significant amount of cash to close, low or no down payment mortgages. There were a variety of things that were very intentionally in place, and I don't mean to preach to the choir in this room, but it's almost as if we have a sense of amnesia at times about what those things were that worked and how we established this whole white middle class. And some of those same things we need to do now for the people who weren't permitted to take advantage of those things when we did that 50, 60 years ago. And yet these providing low down payment mortgages is viewed as just irrationally risky almost. And it's not, and it shouldn't be. And we do have other ways which some limited number of families are able to put very little money down and get into sustainable home ownership. But some of this isn't rocket science. And there was somebody on the prior panel who said something about, I don't want to study it anymore. Like, we know what the problems are. Yeah, we know what the problems are. Now we need to do something about it. And I do think that there are things that we are doing, and I'll pause and get off my soapbox here now. There are things that we're doing that I'll talk more about as the panel evolves. But I really want to just put a plug out for, we know that what we've started with in terms of our commitments to addressing equitable housing finance, we know that that's just the beginning and that we need to dig deeper and do more. And we are committed to partnering with all of you in doing so. And I've met some people in the room here today whom I'm surprised that I have not had occasion to meet previously, but I'm really excited to be here today to build some new bridges on this journey. So
I so appreciate the focus also on, like, we have documented many of these barriers before, and so now it is time to shift to solutions, and that we might have evidence already on what it takes, but we just have maybe not applied that evidence. And so I think those are good reminders of, like, what is the foundation and starting point we have. And Katrina, to that point, Pamela, the way you phrase, like, here's what we tackle first, but then we also know, like, we have to have steps 2 through 5, like, probably pretty well established in order to make those successful. And I'm curious how you've been thinking about what that sequence of events is.
No, I appreciate your points, Pam. I would say, yes, we've documented what we understand as the problem, but let me just step back and share that I work in an organization with 7,600 people. You all are the experts. 7,600 people at Fannie Mae don't know those facts. I'm just going to say it. They don't know those facts. And so what we've done is taken a step back in what we call a problem-solve approach around what is the problem that we truly need to solve from the seat that we're sitting in, where we can have, and I think Yannicka, you use this, use our superpowers to have the greatest impact. And so part of what we did when I started to peel back and get the data that you all have so eloquently talked about, I said, give me all the data, the research, the literature. I got pummeled with tons of information. You all do a lot of good work and a lot of great reporting. But how do you create a consumable way for people to understand what actions you want us to take? Therein lies the creation for us of what we call the consumer housing journey. And I love the consumer housing journey. The first one was Linda's housing journey. And her housing journey was the housing journey most of us had. And it was focused on Black renters, first-time home buyers, and homeowners. How do I take all the rich data, resources, and reports that you all make available, distill it into consumable parts so we understand early formative years when Linda either is a renter or she's living with her family, when she becomes a first-time home buyer or a homeowner. The whole point is we all have a housing journey, but what we don't know and appreciate are the obstacles that we face along those housing journey that's unique and individual, but it helps us to shape sort of a view, a consumable way of describing, here's what it takes for Linda to be successful, and here's what it's also taken to take her off her sort of path to being successful across housing. What I shared with our single family team, I don't know why it took me so long. I've been at Fannie Mae 28 years. I said, renters are important. How in the world do you create and curate a pipeline of successful first-time home buyers if you don't start early on in their housing journeys? Well, that's because we don't study renters in the way that we can bring about the right solutions. And so that's what we've been doing. And if you are readers of our Equitable Housing Finance Plan, you'll see that the housing journeys continue to be the chassis with which we're driving innovation and our solutions. What I'm also excited about, it's a problem solving that we do across 7,600 people in the company. As my economic strategy and research team would say, we've created the Rosetta Stone on how we're talking about the problem. I'm convinced if we cannot align on the problem, we can't align on the solution, period. We just can't. And so for me, I am your vessel to get all of those 7,600 people aligned on the obstacles, the challenges. So then 7,600 people you have available who are innovating from the seats that they sit in at Fannie Mae to address a particular obstacle on the housing journey. So when we rolled out Jose's housing journey and this installment of the Equitable Plan that accompanied Linda's housing journey, it wasn't a surprise, but not a surprise that there were common obstacles across both the Latina housing journey and the Black housing journey. 60% of the obstacles are shared across both those journeys. And it wouldn't be surprised if I talked to all of the practitioners such as yourselves when I asked well, we can't solve it all, but what are the 4 things you want Fannie Mae to focus on? Insufficient credit, largest obstacle, disproportionately impacting Black and Latino families. And when I say insufficient credit, low credit, thin credit, no credit. Yes, you got to define it. Therein lies how we solve for it. The second obstacle is exactly what Pam covered off on. And I'd say that takes 2 shapes. Upfront housing costs, so renters being housing cost burden more so than ever. How are they going to be able to save for a future down payment? And then those who want to become first-time home buyers, exactly right. They don't have the generational wealth, as Pam's describing, to cover off on down payment and closing costs. And then that's from an equity and access perspective. Think about financial resilience. My brother just bought his first home. And I appreciated the point someone said about savings. Furnace goes out. Who's his mortgage reserve account? It calls me. Absolutely not. Financial resilience and housing durability. So important as you think about the key obstacles that are going to allow Jose and Linda to be successful. So as I think about our corporate strategic plan, pretty excited. I don't have to sit here and talk about what we've prioritized. We prioritize these 4 key obstacles at the top of the house. You have 7,600 employees understanding with data, thank you, Urban, with literature, with reports, that's driving how we drive solutions, how we go back and forth, share the uncomfortable truth. They hate to see me coming. I've got a new report, and we got new data to add to the housing journeys. Read it. Read it. But it's true. The point is, unless we're going to be students, and I appreciate I am a student in this space, I am your voice to drive what the problems are, the obstacles that we need to drive collectively. And the other piece is our housing journeys are public. If you have data, literature, resources we need to be adding to the housing journeys for the benefit of all of us, stack hands, get aligned, that's how we make a difference. Can't make a difference if we all don't align on the obstacles. And then where on the place, because you're right, Pam, we cannot do it alone. Where are you on the housing journey where you can lean in and make a difference? Because it is not a silver bullet and it's going to take time. So I'm going to stop with the housing journey and the obstacles, because that's the chassis with which we are driving our problem solving and the foundation of our equity plans.
And I like how concrete that is, right? It's taking what's happening in the field as a whole, but making it really specific and not only humanized, but also like to see those shared obstacles makes, I think, creates more power. And so, Dimitri, like Katrina mentioned, you've got to think about what the renter's journey is also as like an entry point into this. And I know that's something that HUD's been focusing on a lot, and thinking holistically about what are all of the touch points in access to homeownership and even encounters with the housing system. How are you prioritizing between some of these problems that we've already heard about? Like there's the wealth gap, there's a liquidity gap, there's a credit gap, there's appraisal bias. Like how does HUD think about not only seeing those connections, but also prioritizing which ones you're able to tackle?
Well, I'll say it's all hands on deck at HUD. This is like a major priority for Secretary Fudge. So, we all have our various offices within HUD. And so on this issue, hard to believe, but we're not siloed. Awesome. Right? So we've got, FHA has their role, and the Deputy Secretary mentioned some of the FHA stuff. Like she mentioned, for instance, reducing the MIP, right? And so that for people who are homeowners, then that generally is a savings of $800 a year annually, which can certainly help pay probably for a lot of things, including maybe in property taxes, right? And so there's the FHA role in this whole thing. We're talking to them about stuff. There's the whole issue of LEP issues in the FHA space, right? Or I think it was mentioned on the previous panel, like, are we having like serious language access issues, right, with people who are trying to buy homes, right? Of course, we've got PDNR, our research arm, and they work very closely with you guys. But when you talk about Linda's story, when you talk about Jose's story, I will tell you that in the Fair Housing Office, our authorities are very specific. They grow out of statutes like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. They grow out of the Fair Housing Act. It was mentioned earlier, and there was such a great dialogue earlier about how this whole thing started that Joe led earlier with Michael. And it was just, it's the Fair Housing Act of 1968, folks. 1968. Let's let that sink in, right? But at the same time, it is because of the Fair Housing Act that we are actually taking in close to 200 appraisal discrimination cases right now. People don't think about the fair housing issues when it comes to, they've heard the reports, they've seen the documentary Lowball, but you actually can pick up the phone or go to your website and file a fair housing complaint on this issue, right? And because the Deputy Secretary said it's not just about getting people to have home ownership, it's about getting wealth out of those homes, right? And so we're dealing with all of those cases. We have a certain amount of days we got to deal with some of these cases. We have cases, one of our nonprofit grantees, footnote, we have a NOFO out right now. So just let everybody know that our FIP, our Fair Housing Initiatives Program, is available for mostly nonprofits to do fair housing work. So we want to get local, right? So going back to earlier this year, one of our FIPs actually did some testing in the fair lending space, and they found different treatment, right, of Black testers versus white testers, right? And so that ended up in a very local level, because it was in Seattle, I believe, where there's some controls that are being put in. There's some programs being put in, right, because of that. So people, I just want to make sure that people don't forget, this is not just about the Freddies and the Fannies, who are wonderful, but people are going to continue to have individual issues. Looking at things systemically is critically important, right? But when people have issues, they've got to be able to use those resources. And so that's another type of case. We've got had another case where some folks targeted Black and Caribbean homeowners in the New York area, right? And so it was horrible. These were already homeowners. They tricked them into handing over titles, and so now they're not homeowners. Right? So we're talking about getting people to be homeowners, but can we keep people in their homes? And when you have that home, what is the impact of environmental justice on your home? Right? Where is your home being built? What's happening in your home? We recently settled a case, VCA, we entered into with the city of Chicago that was moving a factory from a white neighborhood to a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood where they already were managing and having to deal with all the factories there. What does that do to a homeowner's experience, right? And so that's part of it. And so that's kind of like my space. But so we're all having different priorities, but it's like a one HUD approach to this whole kind of thing. So
I appreciate the reminder that we've got, from all of you, that there are individual experiences that also then need to drive our understanding of what those structural solutions need to be, right? And so we're operating at multiple levels when it comes to fair housing and homeownership at all the time, right? You're toggling between these, like, what's the structure that we set up? What's the, like, how do you appropriately fund enforcement? How do you appropriately, staff civil rights cases in response to those individual complaints or concerns or experiences, so that, like, we're then feeding into a more robust system. And I guess that made me wonder, for each of you, how are you thinking about what's the part of the ecosystem that you would like to see strengthened?
And I'll just say, too, speaking of the Fair Housing Act, I will say that, and folks in the room might know this, end of 2021, we issued, our OGC, our Office of General Counsel, issued guidance, our office, Fair Housing Office, issued a statement making it clear that special purpose credit programs do not violate the Fair Housing Acts, right? Yeah. And so there was a lot of hesitancy from the lending community to go there and to create a special purpose credit program for populations, for instance, who don't have that generational experience of home ownership, right? And so that was very much a whole federal government kind of effort, but it was certainly led by this statement that we put out. And so there's, as recently as last month, the Secretary and others attended a roundtable with industry folks, with folks who are on the ground, trying to push the industry and hear from the industry, like, okay, why don't we have more by now? And so when you say what I would like for there to be more special credit programs without people complaining and saying, no, because you're gonna, get mad at us for violating the Fair Housing Act. We said we're not.
So, there's so much in what you just said I want to respond to. I'm almost like,
Go for it, jump on it.
One thing I wanted to say about the individual actions and the fact that people are filing a lot of complaints, for example, in the appraisal space. So we can say those are individual actions. Those individual actions helped to catalyze all these individual reports that were that a lot of folks wanted to say, this is just an anecdotal, this is just anecdotal evidence of appraisal gaps and appraisal bias. And, one of the things that spurred, and one of the things that we as GSEs are quite good at, is it spurred us to doing research. And we took the treasure trove of appraisal data that we had, and in mining all those tens of millions of appraisals that we have the data on, we were able to detect evidence of systemic issues that could not be explained through anecdotal there's not a problem there. And I want to say, I often get a little discouraged, the valley of despair, my team will call it. I often get discouraged because change does not happen overnight. I'm a very impatient person, passionate and impatient. But when I think back to the beginnings of our conversations about appraisal bias, there were participants in the appraisal system who were the most entrenched and defensive about the fact that they perceived there to not be any issue, nothing to see here. And now those very people in the appraisal industry and the stakeholders themselves are now linking arms with those of us who had shined a light on potential issues. They are now linking arms with us to be part of the solution in changing the system that has bias baked into it. And it's what I often say, it's so hard to take the sugar out of the cake. When the system has the bias baked in, we have to recognize it for what it is and really link arms, including linking arms with those who are incentivized to continue the status quo.
But there's also, if I could go off
Yeah.
and riff off of that, is there's also an opportunity for states to get involved too, right? And I say that because, for folks who are not realizing this, the average it's about 93% older white males who are appraisers in our country, right? And so we've got to see a more diverse, profession. And so it was because there's a report, right, that showed what states were the best and worst on these issues, to your point. The state of Mississippi was really low. And so it was the appraisal subcommittee that joined with the state of Mississippi's, I guess, I don't know, their Bureau of Regulation of Professions, whatever. And they actually created and implemented a program that actually has created people of color who are appraisers today. And so when we talk about getting local and things of that nature, based on what you're saying, that's some of the more work
So,
to do.
and I think that's fabulous. I'll stop.
No, this is good.
I think that's fabulous,
make
and
sure
the
Katrina gets
appraiser community most definitely needs to diversify. I mean, it's embarrassing,
Talk
frankly.
about our appraisal diversity initiative, Pam. And then I'll pivot to another area where it's near and dear to my heart.
So the GSEs have partnered with the Appraisal Institute on what we call the Appraisal Diversity Initiative, and it is a very, I should let Katrina speak to it. So you speak to it, and then I'm going to speak to...
Well, I'm going to let you all finish appraisals because I want to go to one.
You want to go into SPCP?
No, I want to go into insufficient credit because that is so pervasive. And it's near and dear to my heart to my man children who don't believe in credit and one has thin credit. So what does that mean? They're not part of the system. They're not part of the system, but keep going.
Well, I'll try to tie this off then. So we are literally going around the country and holding events, and that's Fannie and Freddie and the Appraisal Institute, holding recruiting events to recruit into the appraiser profession more diverse candidates, including giving them scholarships for the coursework that they need to complete, giving them mentors.
I was going to say matching them as apprenticeships.
Yeah, matching them for the apprenticeships that they
required.
need. And all of that is fabulous. And I'm deeply invested in us continuing that work because I do not believe that we are going to fully replace human appraisers, but there is so much promise in using technology as well, alongside of using human appraisers in order to solve for some of the issues that we've encountered and some of the promise of what we can do to kind of to equalize some of what is happening in the appraisal industry.
So definitely going to come back in a couple of months to talk about what that like affirmative and positive use of technology can be, while we're also trying to acknowledge like the role of the credit appraisal workforce or any workforce as like mediating like how effective or inclusive a system can be. I just want to remind everybody as we're heading to into these last set of questions, please scan the QR code, enter your questions that you would like to ask the panelists, And then in about 10 minutes, we'll move to audience Q&A, and I can at least start off with some of the things that you've already got turning in your gears turning. So Katrina.
Well, I'm so glad you all talked about the appraisal process, and as we internally talk about the holistic journey, again, keeping renters successful allows us to have conversations about ensuring that when they become homeowners, they have the opportunity to accrue value from that home that they purchase. And if I think about insufficient credit, one of the data points that always I hold near and dear is the fact that less than 10% of consumers' rents that they pay is reported to the credit bureaus. Think about that for a second. Your largest, most reoccurring monthly payment you may forego the cable bill, okay, in some houses you may not. You may forego the telecommunications bill, but you're always gonna make that housing payment. 10% of those payments, not even reported to the credit bureau. And you say, well, the 10% that is reported, what is it? It's negative. So the renter doesn't even get the benefit of seeing themselves as being credit worthy. But here's what that translates to. That group is disproportionately made of Black and Latino families, so they're not being seen. This group is also paying the highest cost to get access to traditional forms of credit. This group is also paying high costs for insurance. Think of the things we do every single day. This group has to pay deposits to get utilities to put on. I'm just demonstrating for you up front, early in the housing journey, we need to figure out how to see renters and ensure that they're seen as credit worthy because they're not seen in the traditional system. And the GSEs have spent a lot of time working with third parties and fintechs to enable our multifamily property owners to enable the ability for those monthly payments, those rent payments, to be reported to credit bureaus. Pretty powerful. In our portfolio, about 350,000 property owners and about 60% minority census tract are now reporting rental payments to credit bureaus. So you say, well, what does that mean? Because we measure impacts and we measure outcomes, not that we just did it. The impacts are pretty powerful. About 250,000 residents who are getting their payments now, those rental payments reported, 10% of those families now have credit scores. Think about that. The other group who had credit scores, and this is the piece of data that always surprised lenders, what would you do if you see a 60-point improvement on average in that credit score? For many of those consumers, they move from a subprime loan to prime financing. My point is, it's so critical that we see people where they are and use systems and technology that enables access to greater forms of traditional financing. So these families who are already, like I said, rental cost burdens in many ways, how can we get them lower costs as their renters so that they move into being a first-time homebuyer when they're ready? And when you're ready, we also look at rent payments to qualify you as well. Much like what you all are doing.
Yep.
Again, your single most important payment. Typically, when I was a loan officer, I'd get 12 months canceled checks to demonstrate you made your rent payments. We've automated all of that. Take the human element out of it and ensuring that the loan officer is originating that loan, treats that loan as any other loan. Bank asset data comes in, we look at your monthly reoccurring payment. We're able to give you now access to credit. Since we rolled out the program in September of 2021, I believe, more than 4,500 borrowers have been able to get access to our positive rent pay history service. These are loans that are now eligible for sale to Fannie Mae. And of those consumers, more than half identifies a family coming from a minority class. I mean, so think about it. We didn't change our credit box.
That's right.
At all. We kept our systems in place. Lenders are able to leverage our automated underwriting tools as they do today. We've enhanced those systems to see consumers who've been outside the system, where the loan officer's been doing those loans, but perhaps on the side of their desk. Let's bring this into mainstream. So this is business as usual. Those are the investments that people need to make today to get to those consumers who are certainly credit worthy.
So I'll leverage that, since both enterprises have done that work to build in this capability within our automated underwriting systems to be able to model cash flows by looking at bank account data and in addition to looking looking at what is on the borrower's credit file. And it's so critically important, particularly as we move into this era of, I'll say non-traditional income streams as well. Gone are the days when the vast majority of middle-class families had W-2 income. Our children, the next generation, there are a lot of different ways that a family cobbles together its income stream. And it may be coming in from multiple sources. The gig economy is here to stay. Yes. And so our investments in these tools and ability to model assets and income by looking at bank account data for an individual really enable us to harness the power of technology to provide access to credit to many more families. And oh, by the way, who are, as Katrina mentioned, disproportionately Black and Latino.
And to build on that, because I love that point, so the using your positive rent pay, I always say that's my son Eric with the one credit card, thin credit. My other son who's just opposed to any kind of debt, he lives on Venmo and PayPal. I said, all right, Brand, I got you. We have the cash flow underwriting. So for him, looking at the same asset data, how do we look at his inflows of income and the outflows of expenses? There is a way to assess credit worthiness just by looking at bank statements. So when he's ready, he's not ready yet, but when he's ready, the whole point is this is our journey to start to see more people in a safe way that's good for the consumer, a long-term sustainability way, and it's also good for us from a GSE perspective, right? But it's also ensuring you're seeing people where they are. They're not doing anything but managing their business. We're just trying to get smarter and using technology to give lender greater certainty that's going to enable access to more equitable financing options.
I love these examples of how you're trying to be responsive to all the changes in the structure of our economy, right? All the changes in the structure of the way people seek housing and the forms of housing that they seek, the forms of jobs and income that they seek. And you've, as you say, staying business as usual, have managed to update and respond to that in a way that makes sure that one of the key goals of all of these equity executive orders and your equitable homeownership plans is to make sure that you are reaching everybody who is eligible. And these are just such concrete strategies for doing so. Dimitri, I'm curious if there's ways in which HUD is thinking about not just the connections with industry and other players who are overseeing this sort of housing finance system, but are there other systems, as was mentioned in the earlier panel from local government? Is it transit? Is it others who we need to be building stronger connections with so that equitable homeownership can really become a reality?
Equitable homeownership, I think, is part of fair housing, right? And so to that extent, I mean, everybody knows the elephant in the room is when is the AFFH rule coming out?
I was going to go there next.
It's coming out. It's coming out. It's coming out. But short of that, we created the interim final rule. And so there actually are jurisdictions who are currently doing fair housing planning and submitting their plans to us. And so for folks who are not aware of what this is, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing provision was part of that 1968 Fair Housing Act rule, which is not about just simply not discriminating. It's about what are you doing to actually realize the purpose of the Fair Housing Act, right? To proactively, positively make sure that fair housing exists, right? And so the planning process that's taking place right now, it could be done under the old school analysis of impediments to fair housing way, or it could be done under the 2015 rule. Either way is fine. But I think at the end of the day, that's about looking at program participants, which are local government, state government, public housing agencies, home consortia, for them to look at what are they doing to help further fair housing. And homeownership is part of that. And so that's hugely important, and I'm glad you had the previous panel talking about local types of issues, and they were talking about things that they were doing, but there are plenty of units of government that are not doing those types of things, and hopefully some of them will be paying attention, and hopefully the word will get out. But there's a whole lot more. I mean, we asked the question in our proposed rule that we put out, and those comments close in April, folks, so we're not taking comments right now. But we did ask the question, beyond home ownership rates, what other data should we be looking at when we try to create this final rule and assess what those different arms of government are doing or are not doing? And so that's hugely important because things, I think your previous panel talked about things such as land use and what have you. And we actually have a fair housing planning kit online, toolkit online, that people can actually look at and use now. And for instance, in that toolkit, when we're talking about who should be the players in fair housing planning, it includes the Planning Commission, it includes the Zoning Board, it includes the permitting folks, because one of our biggest cities, folks, let's remember, one of our biggest cities in the United States, they don't have zoning. But guess what? When I talked about that environmental justice stuff, you know what neighborhood is what. You know what color, what color a neighborhood is, because let's say of the permitting issues. So these are all the players that have a huge role in home ownership types of issues. So
this has been so both comprehensive but also really vivid and specific on like what some of these levers are that you all have at your disposal and how you're using them. I wanted to turn to a couple of audience questions that sort of pick up on some of these themes. So one is, Katrina, you obviously have made this point very strongly about credit, and one of the questions is how can HUD and the GSEs partner with state and local housing finance agencies to expand access to credit?
Yeah, so we work with the HFAs often, and one of the ways that I'm excited how we work with the HFAs is they're a huge group of organizations that position themselves as trusted advisors to the consumers we're all trying to reach. And I've always appreciated that the role that they play, both from a lending perspective as well as a counseling perspective, enables consumers to be successful, meaning they're always focused on ensuring that the consumer is aware of all of the things it takes to be mortgage and home ready. And so the HFAs have just done a tremendous job leveraging low down payment programs and ensuring that there's a focus on long-term sustainability using their HFA preferred programs as a mechanism for enabling access to homeownership, but also creating adjacent services with housing counseling support. And I always call it housing coaching or financial coaching because it's the way to let people know you don't need help just because you're going to a counselor, but you certainly need reinforcement if you're trying to be mortgage ready from a DTI, savings perspective, income perspective, credit perspective. So HFAs are pretty important stakeholder in all of this because they are certainly positioned as the trusted advisors for the consumers we're all trying to reach and are seen as trusted advisors by those clients as well. That's at least what I've seen. I don't know what you all have seen.
Hey, can I take that for just a minute? Please. So I agree that HFAs play a really important role today in serving minority borrowers. And one of the challenges, I guess I would say, is the fractured nature of the programs that are offered by HFAs. There are millions of dollars of down payment assistance that is offered by HFAs that goes unutilized or underutilized every year. And one of the things that we've done as an initial step, but I think a really significant step to address both the challenges for a loan officer in originating a mortgage in which an HFA down payment assistance program is going to be used, as well as just there's so many thousands of different state and local HFA down payment assistance programs, and they're underutilized because it's too difficult to use them. And so one of the things that we did, and we announced it within the last couple of weeks, we created I don't want to say database, I guess I'll say a tool an online tool called DPA One that is a free resource available to loan officers, ultimately will be available to housing counselors. Some housing counselors have access to it right now. It includes data, including all of the eligibility data for all of the state HFA programs and many of the local HFA programs, so that you can query this tool with a particular borrower's information and immediately know which of these DPA programs this particular borrower is eligible for. And so the HFA providers update their information in the tool so that it is, they have every incentive to keep their data updated. And the tool is pretty slick. It has a really nice user interface. We've been working on it in partnership with housing counselors and with loan officers for several years. So it just officially launched in the month of September, and we're hoping that it helps address the issue of HFA down payment assistance programs being underutilized. There's no point in leaving money on the table that's been allocated, budgeted for already, that borrowers, families can have access to. But frankly, the next step, and I don't mean to move off that too quickly, because we are in fact really proud of DPA One, and it's free and available to the industry, and I'll say that again, it's free. So if you have providers, loan officers, counseling agencies in your communities and you think, we need access to this, please contact me. We've built it for people to come and utilize it. But really the next step, I think, for us is working on standardization, helping to drive
Second lien doc standards.
for all of us.
Yeah.
Where can we standardize HFA lending process so that it is not, so that there aren't thousands of different flavors of this that make it so very difficult and that drive inefficiencies in the market. And I think there's more work to be done, and we are committed to doing it and linking arms with the stakeholders, those on the stage with me and those of you out there as well.
So one of the questions here was, what are the tools or resources or specific supports that you all have? And you've already identified Fair Housing Toolkit. You've talked about DPA One. You've talked about tools that you're making available to the banking industry so that those loan officers can actually be responding to and acknowledging all of the rent burden that people have so that it's actually going toward homeownership. I'm curious if, just on that note of rental data, one of the questions that came in was that many rental data strategies, like you have to pull that data from the multifamily property managers, as you mentioned, or the cash flow data that's from banked consumers. But there are potentially unbanked consumers. There are potentially mom and pop landlords who don't necessarily, they're not in those systems. So to your point about seeing people and making them seen in the data, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I'll start because I know you have thoughts on this one too. That's such a great question, right? One of the things we say, the system is only as good as people use banks. And I get it, large disproportionate number of families of color are unbanked. I'd also say, and this is one of the things when we were at a conference last week, I said, this is where the call to action to all of you, we need to start to think about helping people change behaviors and how they think about getting banked and getting seen. I'm just saying, right? Those are the behaviors that you all can help us drive with the end consumer. The other piece, and I highlight this, is when you're using your bank account, ensure that your bank account is your bank account and that you're demonstrating what you're contributing toward your expenses, your monthly payments. Because this system and the systems that are being automated are all expecting people to be seen in a system. The system we're looking at is the banking system. And so really, as I talked about the solutions that are coming to bear, a lot of these solutions are nascent, meaning they're new, and they're going to require us to think about driving new behaviors for consumers. Another piece that I think is pretty powerful is CDIA, which is the consortium that manages all of the credit bureaus. They have started to establish standards with which the reporting for rental payments get reported to the credit bureaus. That's huge. That didn't happen until like recently. So that's another huge milestone. Think of all of the UMDP-related efforts. This is a UMDP effort for the credit bureau systems. And the other thing I would say is, as we want people to think about their behaviors and being seen, and I love the mom and pop question. A lot of the work that we do in this space, they are enabled through what we call fintechs or vendors. They work directly with the mom and the multifamily property owners to report those rent payments to the credit bureaus. The other place that I challenge a number of these vendors, I'm a mom and pop rental, or landlord, and I have renters. How do you enable my tenant to get access to your platform so that she can report her own rent that she makes to me to the credit bureaus? It's coming. It is coming. Because we want everyone to be seen. When you think about the 44 million rentals in the United States, 60% of them are people like me, single family mom and pop landlords. The benefit that you all can bring, this is through the fintechs, is how you enable people who don't have a multifamily unit to create that capability. Oh, by the way, that's become an amenity for multifamily properties. I go find a new property, and I'm going to say, well, are you reporting my rental payment to the credit bureau? If not, may not be there. My point is we need to create the same thing for landlords who rent, and those landlords have the ability to connect their tenants to this capability. The tenants drive it. Pretty powerful. It's coming.
I like that the incentive for the landlord actually comes from the consumer.
Exactly.
Yeah. So quick lightning question for each of you. What is like, so you've all talked about these interesting kind of changes that you're making and the successes that you can already see. What's a measure of success you are aiming for, that you're aspiring for? Like, if we checked back in with you a year from now, what's a measure that
you go first.
That you'd love to see?
Okay, so I'm going to tack on to what you've said about special purpose credit programs. There are a lot more special purpose credit programs out there than people realize. Some of them were purchasing, some of them were not purchasing. But what I will say about the special purpose credit programs that we see in the landscape right now, and there are a lot of them, but they're really small. And they're largely very expensive for the financial institutions that are offering them. And so what my hope is, in terms of where we are a year from now, is that we have come to market with some alternatives that are more scalable, because I don't have a tremendous amount of confidence that special purpose credit programs will ever be at scale. And when I talk about scale, that's GSE scale, millions of borrower scale. Most special purpose credit programs are 1,000 borrowers here, 5,000 borrowers there. We really need to tackle things that can, at scale, because that's why we exist. We exist to provide standards and scale to the industry. And so we're taking the lessons we've learned and are learning from special purpose credit programs to turn to what can we do that is scalable, that tackles these same issues. And so I hope to be sitting here or elsewhere a year from now with impact to report on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I get asked this question all the time internally. KJ, how are we going to manage our outcomes around this work? Impact and outcomes. And I'd start with saying at the highest level, if you think about the 4 key obstacles that I said that we've prioritized at the enterprise: insufficient credit, access to credit, reducing housing costs, upfront housing costs, and financial stability. You'll see when you look at our actions and our plan, 70–80% of them ladder up to those key obstacles. So for us, hold us accountable to being able to share with you, how many consumers did we remove that obstacle for? That's the first metric. The second one, when we removed it, to what degree? What was the impact? How much of the credit was improved? How many people established credit? How many folks got access to mortgage finance, to Pam's point, to our special purpose credit programs? What was our aggregate contributions to reduce their transaction costs? And then the third one, did we do so in a way that was responsible for the consumer, long-term sustainability, that was responsible to the housing finance system, and responsible for Fannie Mae from a safety and soundness perspective? Those are the outcomes we measure because that's what we can control. There's a lot of obstacles, you all, across the housing journey. Hold us accountable to using our superpowers where we can have the greatest impact. Back to your point, Pam, at scale. That's what I would offer.
I can only say one thing.
One thing.
Well, I was going to say, since HUD is so much bigger and you have many functions, you can get two.
Okay, I get two. So one, I would say that the results from our appraisal investigations, that they significantly stem the tide of the cases that we're seeing,
That's a great.
as well as the work of the PAVE task force, significantly stem the tide. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is, while we are getting some voluntary fair housing plans, this time next year, there will be a rule, right? An AFFH rule. And I am anticipating seeing more jurisdictions really kind of hunker down and get serious and start meeting with stakeholders, meeting with folks in their community. Philanthropic communities welcome to join the party, right? And really start looking at some of the fair housing issues and what they can do about it. If they do it on a voluntary basis, that's perfectly fine. But also, you know, to the extent that the rule is final, that'd be great too. So all of these issues are important. Sometimes people just think about rentals when they think about affirmative furthering fair housing, but home ownership is part of that. That's why we had that question in the proposed rule.
Well, and you've all emphasized how like there's multiple access issues and obstacles that you're addressing, but then there is like, how do we support, how do we retain, how do we like, you know, and graduate people from one, from renting to owning, from owning to owning at, and getting a mortgage that's not subprime, but prime. Like there's so many ways of moving throughout this housing journey that you all are thinking about and have articulated today. I hope what you've all heard today has felt like an interesting kind of zoom out and like sort of scale out from what we heard from the local cities panel. But I think all common themes that I heard throughout were really how important it is for all of these different players in this ecosystem to be coming together. Like philanthropy can't absolve itself. Feds can't, you know, can't say like, oh, well, that's like the states. The states can't keep pointing, you know, to cities and saying it's on them. And so what is it that all of us in this room, in the roles that we play, how do we come together to make sure that there is that kind of unified joint conversation if we're trying to create some of the impact that our guests have highlighted today? So I hope that's what we get to talk about over wine at this reception, so among other things. But thank you all for taking the time to come, for staying. Thank our panelists. And thank you, Living Cities.
Thank you.
Thank you.